Okay, welcome to the this hybrid event arranged by the IET's Anglian Coastal Local Network, which represents members in North Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk. Welcome to those of you in the local audience here. It's really good to see your faces. It's great to get back to face-to-face again here in the atrium at the University of Suffolk. Welcome also to folks joining via Zoom from other parts of the UK and indeed globally. I'm delighted to welcome you all. I'm Kevin Foster, I'm chairman of the Anglian Coastal Local Network, and I'll be your host for this evening. Ronan is Adtran's CTO for EMEA and Asia Pac and a former chair of the FTTH Council. He's a leading light in the global fibre industry and a great speaker, so I'm sure we're in for a treat. So Ronan will describe the full fibre revolution that's gathering pace in the UK and much of the world today. In the UK, incumbents and many altnet operators are racing to grow coverage and take-up. The pace is accelerating and most UK premises will have full fibre available by the middle of the decade. So Ronan will explain how a roadmap of increasingly capable PON technologies will transform the capabilities and the economics of gigabit broadband. He will describe how software-driven networks will transform the rate of change of deployment of new network technology and customer experiences. And finally, he'll describe how this transformed infrastructure will underpin the digital economy and deliver generations of new service experiences. So, Ronan, over to you.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Kevin. Can you guys up the back hear me okay? Excellent. I'll kick things off, I suppose. First of all, I'll do an introduction of myself just to give you a little bit of background. And then I want to introduce the company that I work for just to give you some context. My promise to you is there will be zero sales pitch involved in this. I'm not going to talk about our products or anything like that, but I will talk about the technologies and I will talk about things like architectures, etc., and the implications of some of the technologies that are coming through over the coming years. Just by way of background on myself, as Kevin mentioned, I'm Adtran's CTO for the EMEA and APAC regions. I've been with Adtran for 12 years now at this point in time. Prior to that, I was a customer of theirs for 6 years, so I sat on the operator side of things as well. I've been in telecoms coming up on 30 years now. I think I'm a year away from hitting the 30 mark at this point in time. So I've been through the dial-up era. I used to work with companies like US Robotics on their access concentrators. I went through the ATM era with companies like 4 Systems over the years. And I also worked in the Irish National Research and Education Network with an organization called HEAnet, which is kind of the equivalent of Ucurna here in the UK, where 20 years ago we rolled out a national IPv6 network. So I've always kind of been in the fortunate situation of being able to work on some of the cutting edge technologies within the industry. And my time with Adtran has been no different from that, particularly in the CTO role. First glitch. Let me try space and see will that work. Try the mouse. There we go. Okay. Teething troubles. Let me introduce Adtran to you. First of all, for those in the room here, unfortunately I can't do account for the remote attendees, and welcome to all of you as well. For those in the room here, are any of you familiar with Adtran as an organization? Have you come across us? Okay, perfect. So we're a US-based organization based out of Huntsville, Alabama, of all places, which doesn't spring to mind as the hub of telecoms innovation. But Huntsville is quite unusual. It's referred to as the Rocket City, and it's where all of the rocket development programs, from the original Mercury programs through to the Saturn V rockets, etc., were all developed in Huntsville, Alabama. The net impact of that is you have a massive ecosystem of very sophisticated engineering companies established around the whole space and rocket community, which serves as a really good hunting ground for us to get very sophisticated staff on board within Adtran. And some of the expertise that they bring, we often hear the phrase within our industry, it's not rocket science. Well, quite often we're able to trot out former rocket scientists to customers and go, well, he can say it's definitely not rocket science. But it really does give us a very healthy hunting ground for skilled talent to bring into the company. And Adtran as an organization, For the first 15 years of existence, they really focused on the North American market where they did reasonably well. It was after that then, just over 20 years ago, they started to try and break into the European market. Now, if you go back 20 years ago in the European market, the market was being reset, and particularly from a cost structure point of view, we had the entrance of the Chinese vendors coming into the market. So companies like Huawei, companies like ZTE, that fundamentally turned, particularly for all the European vendors, turned the cost structures on their head. So Adtran arrives into the European market and faces into a new level of competition that it had never seen before. So it took a while for it to hit its stride and find its feet. It acquired the broadband business of Nokia Siemens Networks about 10 years ago. And just very recently, in October of last year, we announced the acquisition of ADVA Optical. So ADVA is a large European optical transport equipment vendor based out of Germany. And post-acquisition, when that deal closes out, the final regulatory hurdle is due to close out on that over the next week or two. It'll see the organization in total with about 2,500 staff globally, 1,300 of which will be based here in Europe, and revenues will be about 1.2 billion. So a reasonable size. It's certainly not the Huawei's of this world, but it's a reasonable size organization. We have production facilities and support facilities dotted across Europe. We also have manufacturing facilities in Ukraine and in Hungary. Now, people wince when they hear Ukraine now at the moment. Thankfully, where the manufacturing facility is in Ukraine, A, it's very close to the Hungarian border, and B, we try to continue to support that team there, because as soon as we pull the production lines from there and shift them all over to Hungary, which Hungary is already doing in parallel, those people in Ukraine lose their jobs. So we're trying to stay in there as long as we can get away with it. And, fingers crossed that is indefinitely as we go forward. As an organization, where Adtran plays is in this part of the network facing down towards the consumers or the enterprise premises. So we do your traditional broadband access equipment. We do all the more modern fiber to the home equipment. We do the CPE equipment that goes into the customer premise. And we do things like the Wi-Fi routing equipment as well that goes within the customer premise. What ADVA brings to the table is this piece of the network. So the metro transport networks and the data center interconnect networks as well. Now they bring other bits and pieces too, but just at a very high level, that's roughly where the pieces come together. So what you'll see is it gives us an end-to-end solution from basically the internet peering points right through to the in-home devices within your home. Where we have most presence in Europe, Germany is our strongest market. Today, roughly 1 in 3 German households connect to the internet through Adtran equipment. Deutsche Telekom is our largest customer, where we basically over 100,000 broadband access aggregators deployed across the German market. But we also work with some of the other big alternative providers in the German market as well. The UK is our fastest growing market. As you guys are pretty much aware, the UK market is basically on fire at the moment with regard to investment in fiber infrastructure. It's fantastic to see. According to Ofcom, when they spoke at the Inca conference there last year, they had registered over 100 operators that had sought code powers. We're aware of about 65, 70 operators that are actively building, and over 40 of those are working with Adtran. They're using our equipment to light the fibers that they're deploying. So we've got reasonable insight into what is happening on the ground here in the UK, but also what's happening across the broader European fiber footprint. I wanted to share, just to kind of set the context, some of the more recent data that's been published by the Fibre to the Home Council Europe. And they every year publish what they refer to as their fiber panorama. And what it shows is the progress of the different countries across Europe on a year-by-year basis. So each color in the stack is a different year. I don't know if you can see the legend. Yeah, there's the legends up on top. And one of the things that you can see very, very clearly is when it comes to the homes passed figures. So this particular chart represents homes passed. So that's the pace with which the operators are building out the fiber networks, but not necessarily connecting households. Okay, so it's what's generally accepted as a term for homes passed is that a household is economically viable to connect onto the network should a customer order service. So this is a representation of the number of houses that are economically viable to connect onto the network if they want to order services. And what you saw for the data that was published in September 2021, so the Fibre to the Home Council every year at their conference will present the previous year's figures. So this year at the 2022 conference, they present the 2021 figures. So the latest figures show 7.7 million homes passed in the UK market, which if you think about where we're coming from 3 or 4 years ago, is exceptional growth. The pace with which the UK is rolling out and adding homes passed. In that last calendar year, up until 2021, they added 3.4 million households to that, which is a remarkable achievement. The one thing I will say is, I would anticipate that when we're looking at the 2022 figures, at the rate of growth that we're seeing, and with the number of operators, including many of the very large scale operators, the Open Reaches of this world, City Fibres of this world, we know Virgin Media is mobilizing as well. I would be amazed if we don't double that figure for next year, because I can see, we see it in the equipment that we're providing to people, but we also see it as we move on to things like the Homes Connected figure. If you look at the UK Homes Connected figure, it's also growing extremely strongly as well. So it's up at about 1.8 million households that have now taken a fibre service and are connected to that fibre service. That's in spite of challenges around the word fibre being used to advertise every type of broadband service, even those being carried by carrier pigeon. The Advertising Standards Authority doesn't seem to view it the way the rest of the industry does, that the damage of the word fibre being used on legacy broadband delivery mechanisms has with regard to operators that are investing in full fibre networks and trying to deliver full fibre services. To that point, I'm based in the Irish market. I spend most of my time traveling. The ASA in the Irish market did outlaw the use of fibre in non-full fibre-based services. And what we saw, first of all, was all the operators had to cease using it. But secondly, we started to see a significant uptick in adoption of fibre-based services for the ones that were real fibre. So it still astounds me that it hasn't happened over here in the UK yet, but give it time. Hopefully they will correct that vision. But the key point is, from a growth perspective, there is strong customer demand out there for fibre connectivity, which underpins the investments that the operators are making. From a vendor perspective, how we tend to look at the market is, within our industry, the way we view it is, you get a period of time when operators, for whatever reasons, it might be an advancement in technology, where they have to start deploying new equipment in a new way than what they've done previously. So they can't just upgrade what they've already got in place. And that opens up an entrance window, basically. And what we see here is kind of the entrance window that existed with regard to the fibre to the home rollouts here in the UK market. And as you can see, it's a very, very short window between, if you look at the types of equipment. So in the central office, we have what we refer to as optical line termination equipment that goes in the exchanges. So that terminates all the fibre connections coming back in. And then you've optical network termination equipment that goes in the customer premise. And what you'll see is the vendor selection window for the OLT equipment that goes into the central offices. It's a very short period of time from when you kind of first start ramping up and around, you know, if we look at this new wave of investment that's going through, it's probably about 2018 when it really started to kick off, through to the point where you've pretty much hit saturation. It's a very, very short period of time. And ultimately, at this point in time, vendor selection has already occurred. So if you haven't been selected at that point in time, because the operators have picked their vendors and now they're in straight rollout mode after that point in time, most of them don't have time to be coming back up for air to rethink their vendor decisions at that point in time, unless there's a major problem that occurs. So for us as a vendor, it's a very concentrated period of time where we've got to work with as many operators as quickly as possible to try and get established. The ONT side of things, if you picture the OLT side of things, is the homes passed figure. And as we saw, that's a much higher figure. It's much further along than the homes connected figure. The ONTs are only deployed when a customer takes a service. So hence why there's a bit of a lag on that versus the OLT deployments, etc. But nonetheless, it's still a relatively short window for selection. The approaches for deploying fibre to the home as well is changing. If we look at the European marketplace, back in the early days of fibre to the home deployments, this is going back 20 years, predominantly in the Nordic regions, etc. The architecture of choice was what we see on the screen there, which is a point-to-point architecture. The technology of choice was predominantly Ethernet, the same type of technology that we run on local area networks within our homes and within our businesses, etc. And the beauty with that architecture is it's completely future-proofed. You've got a dedicated fibre going from the customer's premise, whether it's an enterprise or a household, all the way back to the central office. And if we look at modern transmission systems, over a single strand of fibre, we can pass multiple terabits per second, so multiple million megabits per second over one strand of fibre. So from a future-proofing point of view, there's no question that's absolutely the best approach to take. However, the challenge you've got is, if you look at the number of subscribers that you can service from one piece of equipment, for example, it's not a huge number of subscribers. You have an expensive piece of equipment there taking quite a bit of space and power within a central office, serving less than 500 subscribers. That very same piece of equipment, just using a PON technology, so passive optical network technology, can service at a minimum 10 times the number of subscribers. But depending on how we split that PON, so in the world of PON with passive optical networks, I have one laser transmitting down into a piece of glass called a splitter, and that splitter will then refract that light down through multiple channels down to end users. So we have things what we refer to as split ratios, where we go from 1 to quite often 1 to 32, which is a common split ratio here in the UK market. But we also go as high as up to 128. So if you picture this count here, 4,608 is based on a 1 to 32 split. If an operator deployed that same piece of equipment with a 1 to 128 split, you've got 4 times the number of subscribers, all from the same piece of equipment that could service less than 500 users when you're in a point-to-point mode. To illustrate the impact of this from within the central office, this is an image I borrowed from a report that Telecom Italia produced. You'll notice the text is in Italian. I didn't bother translating it because I don't need to. If you look at what they've done here is they've got 1,500 user configuration. And this is a real life setup that they've set up in their labs in Turin. I've visited myself. And basically on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side of the lab, they've built it with point-to-point infrastructure. And on the right-hand side, they've built it with PON infrastructure. And what you can see very clearly is I need 4 fully loaded OLT shelves to accommodate the point-to-point configuration. Whereas in the PON configuration, I have 1 OLT shelf with 2 slots occupied. So just on an equipment cost alone and power consumption perspective, much, much more efficient. But then when you get into things like cable management, for example, on the bottom right-hand side is the cable management for the 1,500 PON users. On the left-hand side is the cable management, which are full, what are they, 7-foot racks? I think they're 7 foot, aren't they, if you do it in feet? 42 rack unit high racks, basically 2 fully loaded racks just to do the cable management for bringing all of those subscribers back in. So huge overhead with regard to the resource consumption, both on space, both on equipment costs, and also power consumption as well. So what we've seen now is the world is very much transitioning over towards PON architectures as the default build out. And we've seen it here in the UK. I would say 99% of the operators here in the UK are building PON architectures, particularly those focused towards consumer. And what we're also starting to see, both in the UK, but we're also starting to see it now in the Nordics, is a lot of the service providers that have built out point-to-point fibre infrastructures are now being faced with massive challenges because of the rising cost of power. It's a pity. I shared the slides on this 2 days ago, and I've subsequently got the latest power update report out of the UK government, and it's gone up even further again. And essentially what we've seen is a doubling in the cost of power over the last 2 years. So if you think about it, if you've got 2 operators and one is deploying point-to-point technology and the other is deploying PON, over the last 2 years, both of their power bills have doubled, but one of the power bills is 10 times higher than the other guys. That's straight away bottom line erosion for the business, affects the profitability of the business, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really starting to focus the minds now, where what we're starting to see, if I go back to the previous slide for a second, is we're seeing in the Nordics now, a lot of the operators are starting to revisit their whole point-to-point scenario. And what they're saying is, okay, I've got this point-to-point fiber deployed out there in the field. What if I was to take that splitter there and co-locate it with the equipment that goes in the central office and run PON technology over the point-to-point fiber? And that will allow them to deal with a number of challenges that they face. One is the exploding cost of power. It'll significantly lower the power required per subscriber that they connect to the network. But the other big challenge that they're starting to see is point-to-point technology versus PON technology deployments from an equipment perspective represents less than 1% on the global stage. So what's starting to happen is the scale economies have been falling out of the industry. So the point-to-point equipment is getting more expensive. But now what we've started to see over the last 12 months in particular is, in a world with global supply chain challenges where components are getting more and more difficult to source, if I've got one market that's a PON market and growing, and I have another market that's a point-to-point market that's declining, and I've got overlap in some of the components, where am I going to put the components? I'm going to put them in the growth market. What that's doing is it's compounding the supply issues on the point-to-point, which is accelerating the move by these operators over towards PON infrastructures. There are some considerations that you've got to take into account when trying to build a PON network versus a point-to-point. With a point-to-point network, all you've really got to concern yourself with is what's the transmit power, the link budget that the transceivers that I'm using can deal with, and how long is the fiber run that I'm going to send that light down, basically. And you've got to take into account things like, you know, the number of splices along the route. If you typically factor in one splice, which is just the melting of the fiber segments together, because nobody builds a 60-kilometer fiber cable in one strand. You know, you typically are splicing every 1 kilometer or thereabouts to make it a bit more manageable. But when you go into a PON world, it's different. You still have to take into account, you know, the length of the run, the number of slices that are involved. You've got to factor in things like connectorization loss, just like you would do in a point-to-point network. But what you've also got to factor in is the losses across the splitters. And what you'll see here is, depending on the split ratio that I'm employing within a splitter, the loss goes up. So if I'm doing a 1-to-4 split, I've got 7.5 dB of loss. If I do a 1-to-32 split, that's 17.5 dB loss. That's a huge amount of loss for an optical transceiver. If I go all the way up to 1-to-128, I've got 24 dB of loss just going through the splitter. So I could be launching with a transceiver that has 28 dB of link budget, and 2 feet away, I put it through a 1-to-128 way splitter. I've now got rid of 80 to 85, 90% of the link budget availability just based on that. So quite often what you see is with those very high split ratios, the serving area falls from what would be the norm here in the UK of about 20 kilometers, suddenly falls down to less than 5 kilometers. Because you don't have enough link budget to be able to deal with that. So you've got to be able to calculate all of these things. And at each stage, your signal is getting weaker and weaker as you're working your way through. And then depending on how you architect it as well, I give 2 examples here where you'll see there's a direct 1-to-128 way split employed on the network versus doing a 1-to-2 and then 2 by 1-to-64 split, which ultimately still results in 1-to-128 way split. But the problem is I end up with a higher link budget loss across this scenario here, the bottom scenario, because I've got extra insertion loss and extra connectorization loss going through the additional stage of splitting as well. So depending on how you architect the network, that can further reduce the reach that you can achieve with the PON networks. The technologies, thankfully, have been advancing quite significantly over the years. If we look at the original PON technologies, we had A-PON and B-PON technologies. When we look at the bandwidths, you know, when I started my career, I remember, you know, in the backbones of the big telcos, they were deploying OC12 connections, 622 meg connections. And, you know, that was mega bucks to be rolling that out. Now we give that away for, you know, 30 quid a month. You know, it's quite remarkable. There's not a whole lot of the A-PON, B-PON stuff. It's predominantly in the US. Operators like Verizon are still trying to get that stuff out of their network. The usual rule of telecoms, it's really easy to turn stuff on. It's really difficult to turn it off. And they're living with that legacy now today. The most deployed PON technology in the world is GPON by a long, long shot, as in like, you know, 90-something% of PON deployments around the world today are based on GPON technology. And that's got 2.5 gig down, 1.25 gig up of capacity. That's shared amongst all the users that are on that PON ODN. So quite often what we see with GPON deployments, most deployments are typically on a 1-to-32 split. We do see some operators that were a bit more adventurous and did 1-to-64. It's very rare you would ever see a 1-to-128 on a GPON because there's just not enough capacity, to share between people. We did see in the Asian market an early next step where this was born out of, in the Asian market, for those of you that have been to China, been to Hong Kong, etc., you've got familiar with the massive MDUs that they have over there. And what was happening was, you know, 1-to-128 way splits were really attractive because the distance was very short, relatively speaking, because it was all in-building fiber runs. But the problem was you didn't have enough capacity in GPON to be able to split and deal with the growth that they had there. So they pushed forward within the standards and they developed XGPON1. And XGPON1 gave 10 gig down and 2.5 gig up. Now, at the time in the European markets and the US markets, when they were starting to need to consider the next thing beyond what GPON could deliver, they were looking at XG-PON1, but the problem was from a timing perspective, if you look at the relationship between downstream and upstream ratio of GPON, which is 2:1, versus that with XG-PON1, where it's 4:1. Basically, you've got 4 times the downstream capacity versus the upstream capacity. At a time, this is, if we go back time-wise, this is back around, 2013, 2014, when this was being considered, at a time when people were uploading more and more and more all the time. So upstream usage was on the increase, but yet that midway step was basically relying on less upstream happening than what was happening before in the GPON world, if that makes sense. So back in 2015, I personally had the great pleasure of lobbying an organization called FSAM, which is kind of the operator feeder group into the ITU, saying, okay, within the industry, we had developed a very sophisticated technology called NG-PON2. And NG-PON2 utilized multiple wavelengths. Picture, those who are not familiar with wavelengths, just picture colors, and we can blend all the colors onto one fiber. And each of those wavelengths had 10 gig symmetric of capacity available to it. And in principle, you could deliver up to 8 of those wavelengths. And what you would do then is you would deploy a CPE, what we call an ONT, that had a very clever tunable laser built into it that would allow it to latch onto the appropriate wavelength. So you had 8 10 gig symmetric wavelengths on that, loads of capacity, but the problem was the cost of the CPE equipment was so prohibitively expensive that it didn't enjoy mass market adoption. So I lobbied into FSAM at the time and said, look, we need a fixed wavelength version of this that would do 10 gig symmetric, because XG-PON1 was going in the wrong direction from an upstream downstream ratio. We needed a 10 gig symmetric based on fixed wavelengths, so it was much, much cheaper. And if I remember at the time, I urged them to use NG-PON2 fixed so that we didn't add another PON variant. What fell out of that was the XGS-PON. They didn't listen to my second assertion, but thankfully they did listen to the first assertion. And XGS-PON was born. We started to see the first deployments of XGS-PON technology. And to be honest with you, one of the first ones in the world was here in the UK. And basically that delivered 10 gig symmetric capacity based on a fixed wavelength. At the time, much more cost effectively than NG-PON2, but still because of cost curve, it was a brand new technology, it was still quite expensive versus the GPON technology. We also evolved as we started to get more and more XGS-PON being deployed out there. We introduced not a new technology, but a new implementation that took both GPON and XGS-PON within the one transceiver, so the one port on the OLT, and it could deliver both technologies at the exact same time using a method called coexistence, which I'll talk about on the next slide. If we look at where things are going within the industry, back in 2021, the ITU that developed the GPON standard and the XGS-PON standard announced the introduction of the G.HSP standard. And with G.HSP, that delivers 50 gig symmetric capability. So a huge, huge uplift. But again, cost curve wise, way out there from a cost perspective, not something that we'll be deploying anytime soon. We've also seen a lobby group within the industry called the 25GS PON MSA, and they're suggesting that 25 gig PON should be the next step within the industry. There's work going on beyond that as well. The work going on beyond that towards coherent PON, and there's multiple conversations with regard to what coherent PON will be the next step. Is it going to be 100 gig or is it going to be 200 gig? Suffice to say, the PON architectures themselves have a lot of future in front of them. A lot of people are going to go, oh, if you build PON rather than point to point, you're only going to get 10 years out of it. It's just simply not true. The technology continues to evolve. It continues to come down the cost curve with each year that goes by and as the volumes increase out there. I touched on coexistence. I just want to touch on it briefly. I borrowed from Pink Floyd up there, up the top right-hand side, just to explain the concept. But essentially, as I mentioned, picture each technology being deployed on a different wavelength or a different color, being passed into a piece of glass. There's no electronics here at all. It's a prism, effectively. And that piece of glass will merge the wavelengths together. And then down the other end of the fiber, you will either have another piece of glass that will demerge them, or you will just have filters, so only the appropriate wavelength goes through to the right piece of equipment. You see a physical manifestation of just one of the coexistence elements that we have in this scenario it's serving 4 fibers. So you'll see there's 8 inputs for 2 different wavelengths, GPON, XGS-PON, GPON, XGS-PON, GPON, XGS-PON, GPON, XGS-PON. And then these are the outputs basically that feed down into the network. So that allows those 2 technologies to be sent down the one strand of fiber. And then the receiving equipment on the other end has the appropriate filter built in to make sure that they only tune into the right technology and partake within that. The approaches to coexistence within the industry have evolved as well. So the original approaches with coexistence would be, I would have a dedicated GPON OLT and a dedicated XGS-PON OLT, and I would use an external coexistence element to combine the 2 wavelengths. And then down the other end where the splitters are, I'd just connect the right piece of equipment and they would latch onto the appropriate wavelength. And that was great for getting started, but the challenge with that is you're doubling up on the equipment, you're doubling up on the power, the rack space, and so on and so forth. The industry has evolved. So now what we do is we introduce combo transceivers. So the transceivers have developed to allow us to have the GPON and XGS-PON, the MAC circuitry in there, and also the optical circuitry. Also, we've got the coexistence element built directly into it. Now, where that's really nice is we get loss characteristics across the coexistence element. So what you'll see is when you read the link budget characteristics of a combo PON transceiver, that's after the coexistence element. Whereas an equivalent transceiver, we missed it. There you know what to do, Kevin. An equivalent optical transceiver would have to go through an external coexistence element and suffer that loss. So I mentioned earlier, Adtran currently services over 40 of the altnet operators. We also work with the likes of OpenReach and that as well. But what we've seen is a leapfrog approach here in the UK market, because the UK was late getting started with its fibre to the home rollouts in a meaningful scale. By the time they were getting started, XGS-PON was available as a technology, and it was starting to come down the cost curve at that point in time. So a lot of the challenger operators looked at this and said, well, you've got this new thing that's just coming over the hill now at the moment, and I'm building a brand new network today. Does it make a whole lot of sense for me to be using a technology that was standardized at the time? It would have been like 15 years earlier or something like that. So thankfully, a lot of them took the plunge and said, you know what, we're going to get started with XGS-PON, and hopefully the equipment will come down the cost curve. To the point now where I can speak with absolute confidence for our customer base. Of our customers that we have, roughly about 94% of them are now deploying XGS-PON. So I have 2 customers, I think, doing GPON. It's tiny amount. But I know from the other operators within the market that are not our customers directly, that the vast majority of them are also doing XGS-PON as well. So the UK today, it's kind of fortuitous that the UK was late getting started with fibre, because it's now ahead of the whole globe now at this point with regard to the number of operators that are actively deploying XGS-PON technology. So as the rollout targets get addressed over the next couple of years out to 2025, there will be more multi-gigabit technology deployed in the UK than there will be in any other market. So it's actually worked out very, very favorably. The industry itself as well is driven out of scale economies. I mentioned that earlier. So typically what we see on a global basis is roughly around 100 million optical transceivers are shipped into the PON industry every single year. And what we see with that is about somewhere between 95 and 98% of them have been for GPON since the beginning of the fibre to the home kind of mass market rollouts. But what we've started to see, and you'll see now, Kevin, that's coming up now, so just leave it alone, and it'll be on stream now in a second. What we've seen over the last couple of years is slowly but surely XGS-PON has been gaining pace on GPON, and it's been taking over market share. The slide that will come up now in a second shows the OLT transceivers that are being shipped into the industry, and how in Europe, the OLT transceivers will transition to the volume of the market share shifting over to XGS-PON next year. It's already very close to that tipping point this year, but next year it will tip over. But if you actually extrapolate that out on a global basis, you'll see XGS-PON has already surpassed GPON from an OLT transceiver perspective with regard to deployments. Here we go. So you see you've got GPON, which is the blue, XGS-PON, which is the gray. You'll see next year XGS-PON, the bulk of the market has gone towards that. Some of the interesting things, if you look at the forecasts around the next generation PON technology, so your 25 gig and your 50 gig PON, you see even by the time you get out to 2027, you're down at like 1, 2, 3% of the overall market. So it still, has to get the volume in place to allow it to come down the cost curve. And if it doesn't achieve that volume, it'll go by the way of NG-PON2 at that point in time, which ultimately never achieved the volume and didn't enjoy market success. The net impact of all of this multi-gigabit, low-cost fiber technology being deployed is we're seeing increasing competition now within the marketplace. And the consumers are the real ones that are benefiting from all of this. So we're seeing very, very cost-effective gigabit services being made available. The top line here is all the UK operators. You get a feel for the sort of price points, you know, £25 per month from Tube for a 900 meg service, I think is leading the charge. But also what you'll see is the market is moving beyond gig now as well. And a lot of this, let's make no mistake about it, this has been marketing driven. This is not really being driven out of a consumer need, but nonetheless, you know, marketing plays a role within the industry. Leading the European market in the Italian market, and this is only a recent development, and to show the impact of this, we've been working with most of the Italian operators for many, many years and trying to convince them to say, look, the rest of Europe is going XGS-PON, you need to look at it. And it's always kind of been manana, we'll look at it next year, we don't need it right now, you know? Iliad entered the Italian market, it's about 3 months ago, maybe 4 months ago now at this point in time. And their entry offer was 5 gigabits down, 400 meg up for €24.99 per month, euro. And if you were a mobile customer, you got it even cheaper. Okay, so I think it was initially $19.99 a month and then $15.99 a month. So 5 gigabits of capacity for less than €20 per month. It's nuts, like. But it's getting to the point where if you look over on this side and look at the Swiss market, I can get 10 gigabits symmetric for 39 Swiss francs per month. And it's not just with one operator, pretty much every major operator in the Swiss market offers that deal. So you're at, you know, roughly about €40 thereabouts for 10 gig symmetric. So the markets are kind of marching to the point where it's not relevant anymore. It's kind of, you know, I always use the analogy of how many amps of power can your electricity provider provide you into your house? And the answer is none of us know, because we don't care. We never hit the limits. And I think we're going through a period now of what I refer to as bandwidth abundance within the industry, where at least for a number of years, people are going to stop caring because it's not going to be a choke point anymore. I often hear people, you know, oh, what's the killer app? What's really driving the need for this sort of thing? And for me, it's time. You know, I came up with an analogy there recently. I was talking to my wife and we just recently refurbished the kitchen. And I convinced her to go with an induction hob because it was the next big thing, blah, blah, blah. I'm a lead user, by the way, just in case that wasn't obvious at this point in time. And I remember when I spoke to her for the kind of first couple of weeks after she got it, I said, we had a gas hob before that. I said, how do you find the induction hob? And she said, oh, that's okay. It doesn't give me as much control as the gas one, but I like the way I can clean around it. It's a lot easier, blah, blah, blah. Spoke to her after about a month or two and says, how's that working out? And the one thing she said loud and clear was, it's so much faster. I can just heat stuff up so much more quickly. It's so easy to clean, blah, blah. And I said, would you go back to gas? Not in a million years. Well, I thought gas gave you more control. I still wouldn't go back. And to me, that's kind of analogous to what we see when we start to get gigabit connectivity into our homes, is just everything so much quicker. You don't have to wait before you run out the door to send something, you know? The kids aren't holding you up going, hang on, I want to download the latest, you know, Netflix thing, whatever it is, before you get into the car. Everything is just quicker. You don't have to worry about it. And to me, that's probably going to be one of the things that when people adopt these very low cost services, it's going to be very hard to tempt them onto something slower because they'll have gotten used to it at that point in time. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to have to start speeding up a little bit. If we look at adoption, now this is the US market, okay, so I'm conscious of that, but the US market tends to be sort of 6 to 9 months ahead of where the European market is at anyway, so I'm not overly worried about it. But what you'll see that's quite interesting, I've thrown a little star up there just so you can see it. Where we're at today with regard to gig and multi-gig adoption in the US is it's now gone past, you know, Jeffrey Moore's crossing the chasm, you know, that market adoption piece. It's now gone past that critical kind of 17.5%. It's now over 20% at this point in the marketplace. If you look at your up to 100 meg type services, they're vanishing very, very quickly out of the marketplace. And that's because anybody who has a medium that can outpace a DSL-based medium, they're blasting out, you know, here's 500 meg for, you know, $20, here's a gig for, here's 2 gig, here's 3 gig, you know, so they're all trying to outpace each other, but also trying to drive a nail in the coffin of the more traditional technologies that are out there. We're also seeing usage continue to rise as well. So what we saw in Q4 of 2021 last year in the US market was the 0.5 terabyte per month on average. So this is average across all users, was breached. And what you also saw was those that are consuming in excess of 1 terabyte per month was now representing more than 20% of the marketplace as well. And it's fascinating. I've just come back from holidays. We were on holidays in the US for 2 weeks. And there was nobody in the house for the whole 2 weeks. And I got an alert on one of my systems and I started looking at different things within the house. But one of the tools that I was looking at was the tool that manages the Wi-Fi within the home, etc. And I'm able to see the data usage on the network. And what was really interesting was the noise floor within the network now is a gigabyte per day. Right, so nobody in the home, but still all the connected devices. And just for clarity, there's no live streaming cameras or anything like that. There's no cloud managed security or anything. But it's a gigabyte per day, just Google Homes and stuff like that, all just checking in and doing what they do. That's the noise floor. Now, if you think about it, there's still a lot of mobile offerings out there today that only offer 30 gigabytes per month. Well, that's the noise floor in our house, is 30 gigabytes per month. So you can see how the electronics are kind of evolving to tap into all of this capacity that's out there and continue to drive up usage on it to the point where it's abundant now. I can squander 1 gigabyte per day and it doesn't really matter. Now, don't get me wrong, on an ESG side of things, it does. But you know, that aside, we're not constrained on the data side of things anymore. One of the other trends that we're seeing within the industry is a transition more towards what we've seen in the data center side of the industry. So if you look at data centers, go back 10 years ago into the big data centers, and what you saw were what we refer to as big iron Ethernet switches with big blades that you would slot into them, et cetera, driven by the FANGs, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons of this world, et cetera. They pushed to break that ecosystem apart. They didn't want to be tied into a chassis-based system where if they selected a solution from one vendor, they were tied into that vendor forever. They wanted to have more independence, and also they wanted to have more flexible and scalable architectures. So they pushed towards a leaf spine type architecture based on 100% standardized Ethernet switches. We've followed that same path now as an industry on broadband access equipment as well. So a shift away from the closed chassis-based systems towards more open disaggregated systems that again use the same Ethernet technology that's driving the data center industries as well. So there's a lot of scale economies that can be tapped into that. The sorts of impact that that can have. This is an example, not bashing any other vendor. This is our own OLT, our own chassis-based OLT, for which we've hundreds of thousands deployed, versus one of our more recent disaggregated pizza boxes. And the key things that you see over on the right-hand side is the impact from an energy consumption point of view, but also an impact from a size perspective and the amount of space that's required for that type of equipment. So what we're seeing now is with the disaggregated devices, because they don't have the protection, the competitive protection that a chassis system gives, it means you've got to continue to innovate a lot more rapidly with the disaggregated devices, because every time we as a vendor go out, respond to a tender, and we get measured on cost, we get measured on energy consumption, we get measured on space that's taken, we don't have the protection of the chassis to protect each of the line cards. This thing has to stand on its own 2 feet. So we're constantly having to tap into the latest chipsets that become available, the latest components that become available, so we can keep shrinking them, keep packing up the density on it, keep driving down the energy consumption on it, to the point where that's our 4th generation of disaggregated OLT over a space of probably, what, 5 years, something like that, since we launched the first one, you know, so it's a much more competitive landscape out there. How this all scales out as well and how it's all managed, when you move to a world of disaggregation, part of the challenge is you end up with a lot more components in the network to try and deliver the types of services. So this is your classical wholesale type environment. You've got CPs that will connect in on this side via Ethernet. These aggregation devices for the CPs then connect to the core of the network, which is again all Ethernet, which then connects down to the fiber access equipment for either PON with OLTs or Ethernet access based off standard Ethernet switches. You end up with a lot more individual components. So how do you deliver services across that in an automated fashion? And this is where the new equipment has moved to, first of all, more modern protocols to allow them to be programmed much more rapidly and much more efficiently. But also you've got a layer of software-defined networking control over that creates a closed loop intent-driven environment so that you can pass an instruction down to the SDN controller and it deals with all the complexity. So you don't have engineers in there configuring hop by hop across the network. You have a flow-through provisioning system now that basically turns up your services much more rapidly. And in the event of a failure, if something doesn't work halfway through, it'll roll back out the configurations as well, so you go back to where you started. So you start moving towards a world of a self-driving type network that allows your engineers to focus on growth rather than having to deal with, you know, day-to-day admin type stuff. And obviously this scales out as well. So the largest deployments that we have of this architecture in the UK today, based on a 1:32 split, accommodate close to 50,000 subscribers. If I bump up that split ratio to 128, that's 200,000 subscribers off the same amount of equipment. So very, very scalable. Scale economies, next generation technologies that are coming through. Just want to plant this seed. The technologies that secure the scale economies come down the cost curve the quickest and hence enjoy the best adoption within the industry. If we look at the PON industry today, from the history of it, okay, the blue stack is China, the orangey red stack is the rest of the world with regard to PON components consumed. Okay, so and that's China for their own, that's China for their own domestic use. It's, gotta love this. Right, you know the slide I'm talking about. So that's for their own domestic use. It's not for export. So that's not companies like Huawei and ZTE buying components and then exporting to the rest of the world. It's for their own domestic use, for their build outs of fiber at home. What you see, what you notice very quickly is even at 2022, China has been in decline because the volume of new build has been going down over the last number of years. But even at 2022, China represents over 67% of the market. So they carry a huge amount of sway. Whatever technologies they get behind will come down the cost curve the quickest, which maximizes their likelihood of being selected. And that's where, when we get into the whole discussion about what's going to be the next step, is it going to be 25 gig? Is it going to be 50 gig? At the moment, all the big operators in China are backing 50 gig. That's the horse that they're leaning on. The view is for the types of applications that they want to use the PON networks for cellular backhaul, etc., that fits their needs better. Time will tell, but if I was a betting man, I know where I'd be putting my money on that side of things. On the context of next generation technologies and the impact from an architectural standpoint, some of the things that we have to think about is, okay, how are we deploying networks today? What's the architectures that are implemented today? We tend to see three models that are out there for delivery of PON architectures today from an equipment perspective. You've got your classical wholesale non-blocking type model, where if we picture the blue stripes here are your PON access cards, and then these yellow stripes are Ethernet uplink capacity. And in the wholesale non-blocking world, for all the capacity that I send down to consumers, I have to have an equivalent amount of capacity being passed back up towards the CPs within the network so that I don't lose any traffic within the platform. You've then got the model of the more traditional vertically integrated operator, where you've got all your access line cards, you've got a set of centralized switch modules in the classical OLT, tends to be oversubscribed. In this model here with these ratios, I've very generously given it 400 gig of uplink capacity. Very few of them have that sort of capacity out there. Typically it's 100 gig or 200 gig, but we based it on 400 gig. And you can see in a pure GPON world with 16 line cards and 16 ports per line card, you're slightly oversubscribed at 1.6 to 1 within the chassis. Not that big a deal, but just something to keep in mind. In a disaggregated world, if you're using the 100 gig uplinks that's standard in the equipment, you're non-blocking, so you don't have to worry about it. As you move to the next generation and you introduce combo PON, so combo PON is that combination of GPON and XGS PON together, what you'll find is in a 16 port line card, 16 times 12.5 gig, which is your GPON and XGS PON combined, equals 200 gig. The backplanes of all the best chassis in the industry have 200 gig backplanes. So per slot, 200 gig per slot, okay? So for every line card that I put in a combo, I have to put an equivalent line card in of Ethernet switching uplink if I want to preserve that non-blocking capability through the system. In the oversubscribed scenario for the vertically integrated retail service providers, my oversubscription ratio now is up at 8 to 1. Again, probably manageable, not that big a deal, but just something to keep in mind. In the disaggregated world, you implement again, building on innovations from the data center industry, you move towards the QSFP DD interfaces. So these are DD 400 interfaces that are 400 gig capable. And again, you preserve your non-blocking scenario. When you introduce whether it's 25 gig or 50 gig as the next step, it doesn't really matter. In the wholesale non-blocking architecture, that just simply doesn't work. You're going to end up with about 2 slots of customer-facing line card capacity, and all the rest is going to be Ethernet switch uplink capacity. That doesn't really work very well. In the oversubscribed scenario, you end up with either 24 to 1 or 38 to 1 oversubscription. at the first hop in the network. We all know networks are oversubscribed, but generally speaking, in the history of telecoms, the first hop was usually non-blocking. When you see 25 and 50 gig making their way into disaggregated portfolios, they're not there yet today. They'll tap into the DD800 interfaces that are already being deployed within the data center industry. This is the beauty of being able to utilize that Ethernet ecosystem that the data center industry is driving. They drive the volume, pushes it down the cost curve. We can then implement it into lower cost applications like OLTs, et cetera, et cetera. The key point is this generation was fantastic at taking us through the APON, BPON, GPON, XGS-PON eras. But as we now move towards the next step, they're out of puff. They've run out of steam. At 200 gig per slot, you've got some serious challenges if you want to preserve your non-blocking capabilities. Architecturally, when you move to disaggregated, you end up with a huge amount of flexibility as well. Your startup cost is a single pizza box. You don't have to do the whole leaf spine leaf thing. You can do it if you want to, but you don't have to. You can chain devices, you can bring devices up in rings. You can do hybrid leaf spines where you could have a device that connects to CP devices, could also serve enterprise point-to-point customers and serve as the aggregation for your PON systems as well. And then if you want to scale it really, really large, you've got classical leaf spine leaf that most of the industry are pretty familiar with now at this point. Other things to keep in mind is as we move towards the next generation technologies, the components will determine how efficiently we can introduce those next generation technologies into the networks. So for example, if we go back to 2016, we were on typically 28 nanometer technology at that point in time, which was the volume chipset for GPON deployments. It was optimized for GPON deployments. It did allow us to do the first early introductions of technologies like XGS-PON, but you couldn't do it at the same density that you could do it with GPON. So typically what we saw were things like 4-port, XGS-PON, OLT line cards, etc., when GPON was already up at 16. 2019 saw the introduction of the first 16 nanometer chipsets, and that allowed us to introduce the 10 gig PON chipsets and start to introduce the first high density 10 gig PON line cards, etc. So moving to 16 port line cards, which is the same density that what we had as GPON. So it allowed for a straight swap of a line card. I didn't have to recable my entire exchange. I could take one out, put the new one in, bish bash bosh, you were done. It also allowed for the very early demonstration of 25 gig PON. So we see that today, there's some 8-port 25 gig cards. I've even seen some 2-port 50 gig cards within the industry as well. So what you can see is within the same compute power, I can do lots of the current technology, less of the next technology, and even less of the one after that. So you've got the technical capability, but you don't have the optimization that you need for large scale deployment. When you listen to most of the leading chipset vendors, they're talking about 7 nanometer technology making its way into the OLT chipset around 2024. So not far away, about a year and a little bit away, a year and a half away thereabouts. And it's at that point in time, first of all, we'll see the initial next gen PON chipset. So for slightly higher density, 25 gig and 50 gig, we'll be able to do a bit more early deployment or experimentation. We will see there's a big focus within the industry of further optimizing the power consumption of combo PON today, so GPON and XGS-PON. And then as we get out to 2030, with 2030, that's when you start to see the volume next-gen chipsets coming through that will allow for comparable port densities of what we have today with combo PON that we'll be able to do with the next-gen combo of 25 and XGS or 50 and XGS at that point in time. But that's out of 2030. But then if you look at the usage curves, et cetera, and the forecast rates for those next-gen technologies, it's not that badly aligned. So the key bit is you've got to align when you deploy these technologies versus the availability of the components that allow you to deploy with equal efficiency and equal port density to what you currently have today. Just about done. Last topic is just on the role of the PON networks for these very high capacity use cases. So if you listen to the 25 GS PON MSA, this is the collection of 54 companies and 12 operators. They make the assertion that we need to introduce 25 gig PON today in the industry because there are large enterprises out there that require a dedicated 10 gig symmetric capability. And they'll make the argument with XGS PON, even though it's a 10 gig technology, it doesn't have 10 gig of actual capacity because there's a thing called forward error correction built in there that allows you to deploy it over longer distances, but it has an overhead that goes with it of about 1.5 gig. So with XGS-PON, you end up at 8.5 gig rather than a full 10 gig. So hence, if an enterprise wanted a full 10 gig service, you wouldn't be able to deliver that over XGS-PON. So that is a fair assertion. However, the question mark is where these PON networks are being built. How many of these very large enterprises that require dedicated 10 gig symmetric that are willing to pay for it exist in residential areas? I'll let you guys answer that. The other use case is cellular backhaul. And cellular backhaul is important, particularly as we move towards cell densification. But if you listen to organizations like the Small Cell Alliance, who are advocates of small cells, they're out there to promote small cells. They'll talk about how they anticipate it by the time we get out to 2027, they estimate that we'll have about 15 million small cells deployed globally. Now, that's a reasonable number. But today, as I talk to you, there's over 20 million PON ODN. So when I say an ODN, I mean a PON 3, you know, so with 32 users on it, etc. So by the time I get out to 2027, that's likely to be 60 million. So in reality, I'm going to have one small cell for every 3-4 PON ODNs. Does that justify introducing a new technology? Particularly when I've got other options available. So we can take a scenario like today and try and service things on XGS-PON, but we've made the point that it may be deficient in some scenarios. What we can also do is introduce coexistence elements onto the PON spine piece that allow us to introduce additional wavelengths. And those additional wavelengths then can be passed through as standard Ethernet wavelengths over the PON structure, delivering dedicated 10 gig or 25 gig Ethernet services that can be used for large enterprise, they can be used for small cell backhaul. And we've a demonstrator in our headquarters where we've got 18 of these wavelengths that can be at 25 gig a piece. So you've got half a terabit per second, just shy of half a terabit, I think it's 450 gig or something like that, of Ethernet capacity. Plus you've still got your GPON and your XGS-PON wavelengths on the same PON tree. So I think as an industry, we really need to think through from an efficiency point of view, cost of equipment point of view, what's the right way? I fundamentally believe the PON networks that are being built today, the fiber networks that are being built today, must be able to service the needs of both small cell and enterprise, large or small. But there are efficient ways of doing it, and then there's less efficient ways of doing it. I think as an industry, we need to think through that. I'm conscious of time. How are we fixed on time?
Are we fixed on time?
Probably a couple of 3 minutes, if that's
okay.
Right.
I'll very quickly breeze through this. In the context of point-to-point overlay, we do still have some work to do as an industry because, as I mentioned earlier, the insertion loss across the splitters is very high. So you got to be very careful about where you inject those point-to-point wavelengths and where you pick them off in the network. If you think about it, at the last splitter in the network, at that point, you're already on a point-to-point to the end customer premise. So if you're able to put the coexistence element in front of the last splitter and peel off the wavelength before it goes through the splitter, you avoid that insertion loss of going through the splitter, which will allow lower cost optics to be deployed within the network. And this tries to articulate it within this slide. Typically what you'll see is a standard low cost 10-kilometer optic, which is what the bulk of the industry deploys today, very cost effective, but you've got a link budget of about 11.5 dB within them. In this ecosystem, you can see the dB losses stacking up as we work our way over towards the right. In most scenarios, you can't deploy that through splitters. You'll have run out of optical budget before you've even got through the first stage splitter. If we move to 40-kilometer transceivers, we can do it on an ODM with a 1-to-132 split, probably out to about 13 kilometers. 80-kilometer optics, which are more expensive, we can get out to about 16 kilometers. And then when you're up at 120-kilometer optics at 30 dB, you can get out to about 18 kilometers. So it's not perfection just yet. We've still a bit of work to do to get a more powerful. I don't want to say more powerful because you get to a point where you melt the optics, but transceivers with better link budgets. So we've got some work to do there. But certainly we can do it today. If you design the ODN properly, we can overlay these point-to-point waves at 25 gig or 10 gig data rates within the system. And then I suppose the closing remarks, we are entering a new territory. As an industry, we have never been in a period of broad bandwidth abundance. Bandwidth was always scarce. People always wanted more and they couldn't get more. Now we're at a point where we're giving away capacity that quite often as people upgrade to these gigabit services, they're getting a 10-fold upgrade. And their behavior doesn't change overnight. They need applications to evolve to take advantage of that capacity. So that's going to take many years to come. So how are the operators going to differentiate themselves? Are we going to get into a race to the bottom here on the cost of the broadband services? not the most sensible strategy if you're spending, billions building out fiber infrastructure. So operators need to start thinking about how do they differentiate at a service level to make themselves more attractive to the customers that are out there. There are midterm drivers that are driving up consumptions on the network, ultra high definition TV services, and I was talking with someone about this last week and going, oh yeah, but how many people watch that? If you think about it, if you go into your local Dixon's or PC World or whatever, wherever you buy your TVs, and you go in with the purpose of, I'm going to get a 40-inch TV, but I only want a high-def TV. You can't buy it. High-def is for 32-inch or below. Once you go above 32-inch, it's almost impossible to buy a high-def TV. All of them are just 4K now. And the price points are like 200 quid for a 4K 40-inch TV. It's ridiculously cheap. So the ecosystem, as people are just going through upgrade cycles on their consumer electronic side of things, between the gaming consoles, between the TVs, etc., they're all being pushed towards ultra high definition. The over-the-top providers, and make no mistake about it, 4 years from now, all TV content is going to be delivered over the top because the cost of any other delivery mechanism is just way too expensive. There's enough capacity out there in the industry today to allow for reliable over-the-top. The Netflix TCP-based transmission model is well proven. Nobody questions that anymore. So it's just a timing issue before Sky shuts down its satellite service and Virgin Media, Liberty Global shut down their cable, their QPSK-based TV delivery and move to IP over the top. It's like I say, I predict 4 years and we'll be done. Everybody will be gone over that. So that'll all be ultra high definition content largely at that point in time. So what's that going to mean? Well, actually, it doesn't have that big an impact because at 25 meg a stream, throw 3 TVs into the average household, 75 meg, maybe 100 meg if you've got 4 TVs against a gig service. That's not going to consume at all. The gaming subscription model is helping drive some of the consumption. So I see it in our house. Our house is 2 adults, 2 kids, nothing unusual going on there. We're not hosting web servers or anything like that. And we get through 2 terabytes per month, have done every month for the last year and a bit. The Xbox consumes 1 terabyte of that. And that's just my son downloading the same games over and over again. We're kind of in an era now where if you go back to the 90s when the first MP3 players came out and you had a gig of storage and you had to constantly delete songs off to put new ones on and stuff like that. If you look at the top 10 games in both the PlayStation and the Xbox game stores, within the top 10, there's nothing within the top 10 that's less than 100 gigabytes in size. The top 3 or 4 are over 200 gigabytes now at this point in time. When you have a games console that ships to market with 500 gigabyte of storage, but only 350 of that is usable because the operating system takes the rest, that means you can fit, 1, 2, maybe 3 games on it. So this cycling, like we used to do with our MP3s on our 1 gig MP3 players, is now happening in the gaming industry. So that's driving some of the consumption within that. For me personally, the next big battleground for the service providers to make the name for themselves is on the Wi-Fi. No point in getting a gig to the door if you can't get it to the devices. And I think a lot of the industry is starting to wake up to that. And then the last point is just the timing of the introduction of the next steps of technology is key. I think 5G is probably one of the best examples here, where if you look at the revenue growth that the operators who have aggressively deployed 5G have enjoyed, you're going to have to look very hard to find it because it's been slow. The take-up has been pretty slow on that. So if you're rolling out a technology too far advanced of the demand curve that's out there, people will not be willing to pay for it. And you're also going to carry a lot of other costs of component costs, higher energy consumption, and so on and so forth. So as an industry, we've got to get the timing right with regard to the appropriate components, bringing the appropriate density, the appropriate power consumption signatures, but also the market demand rising to meet that need. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
Thanks very much, Ryan. That's a great presentation. George, can I hand over to you?
Yes. I will start with a question from Chris Tapp on the Zoom side. And Chris says, given that there is a drive to cloud technologies, when are more providers going to start offering symmetric services? It's frustrating having a 2 terabyte cloud backup service when upload speeds are limited to 100 megabits or less and large file transfers needed.
Sure.
I don't know how you can answer that. Assume it's UK.
Okay, well, I'll focus on UK initially, but to be honest, it applies across all the markets. So Chris, first of all, thanks for joining and thanks for the question. Look, The key point is you'll have seen from the technologies that we talked about there. Here in the UK, the main technology that's been selected, at least across all the altnet community, is a symmetric capable technology. XGS-PON is 10 gig symmetric. We talked about forward error correction, so 8.5 gig symmetric, but it's symmetric. So when service providers offer an asymmetric service over that, which they're perfectly able to do, the technology allows you to configure it that way. That's an economic choice. And quite often what you'll find is there's a mix between aspirations to get into the enterprise space, so they want to keep a symmetric offering as a differentiated service, or for those that are already established within the enterprise space, there's a nervousness around cannibalizing, premium revenues coming from enterprise customers based on, symmetric services that are being offered versus the asymmetric services that the consumer has out there. So it's no longer, again, going back to bandwidth abundance, it's no longer a technical limitation. The technologies that are coming through today that are being deployed across the UK, increasingly we're seeing it being deployed across Europe as well, are all natively symmetric from a technology standpoint. So it's really just a commercial issue in that scenario. As we look forward to the next generation technology beyond that, I really don't see anybody going back to an asymmetric technology. I think what we'll see is the foundations will have been put in place. The one thing I will say, there's a phrase I often use within the industry, and that is the bandwidth always precedes the applications. And if you look at most of the applications that had been deployed, particularly as Kevin talked about the DSL era, etc., they were all asymmetric applications. It was all download type driven. They didn't need a whole lot of upload. But if we look at the trends that are going on with the younger generation now, their TikToks and all that, there's an awful lot of more upload and an awful lot more focus on upload. And to that point, I too have a 2 terabyte per month backup for all the Apple devices within the house as well. Thankfully, it doesn't choke out, even though my uplink, I'm a good example actually. I have 1 gig down and I've only 100 meg up. Haven't hit the sides on the 100 meg just yet, but your point is well noted. But it's a commercial decision. It's not technical.
I'll take another question from Zoom, then open one up to the floor. And this one's from Richard Edney, and it's a little bit of a challenge. He says, a fibre foundation for the next 100 years. Yep. Do you really think that the fibre infrastructure being deployed today will last for 100 years? It's
a great question. It depends on the quality of the deployment, is a large part of it, and the environment that it's deployed in. I've seen scenarios where I visited a colleague of mine in Saudi Arabia, and he showed me the fibre connection to his house, which was basically the raw fibre running up the side of his house. All the insulation had been rotted away from the sun over a period of about 2 or 3 years. And that was because the operator in question had chosen a very cheap supply of fibre. Hence my comment with regard to depends on the conditions, etc. I think if you look at it, first of all, the fibre assets, most of the credible fibre suppliers, the manufacturers, will rate their equipment for 40 to 50 years to begin with. And I think the reason they don't go longer than that is they're just into the great unknown at that point in time. They don't know how long it's going to last. I think the reality is, yes, some of the equipment will degrade, or some of the fibre itself will degrade over time. If the question is about the medium's ability to keep up with growth, again, with multiple terabits per second being transmitted across fibres every day of the week here in the UK and across the globe, I don't think there's any question about that. I think there's enough capacity there. And also, if people do a juxtaposition with regard to wireless, you really have to remember wireless in these very high capacity applications is really fibre with a wireless last hop, a very short last hop. So, people have, I quite often hear people tell me that 5G is going to replace fibre, and I'm sort of going, well, 5G without fibre is nothing anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So it just depends. I know I've kind of nuanced that response. Me personally, I'm comfortable enough that for the next 40 or 50 years, the individual fibre cables should be good. I'd be amazed if they don't go longer than that. We've seen that with some of the copper infrastructure that's out there, that there's copper. I was in Australia there on working assignment there for 1.5 years there about 2 years ago. And some of the copper assets that we saw down there, with paper-based insulation and stuff like that, had far surpassed, I think, the expectations of both the operators that deployed them and the manufacturers that produced them. And I expect we'll see something similar with fibre. There has been a huge amount of innovation that's gone on within the fibre manufacturing industry around what they refer to as passive optical LAN type cabling. And cabling that has a very, very, very small footprint, so it's nearly invisible. and cabling that can survive very difficult bend radius. So one of the things with fiber is, as you bend the fiber, you will get leakage of the signal through the fiber. If you darken up a room and put a red laser that's visible to the human eye into a fiber cable and wrap that fiber cable tight, you'll see the light leaking out of the cable, which manifests itself as attenuation. So the signal's getting weaker. So if you picture most of our houses, very few of us live in round houses. Most of us live in houses with 90-degree corners. So when you put a fiber cable through a 90-degree corner, you lose a lot of link budget going around that corner. So the cable manufacturers have focused heavily in on cables that have much less leakage, perform much better with those very tight bend radiuses, etc. But I think ultimately what this comes down to is there's two aspects to it. First of all, lead users like me represent 1% of society. You know what I mean? It's a very, very tall or very, very small fraction of society that understand the benefit that that could bring. So in the absence of that understanding, you don't have a market demand there for it in the first place. The other piece is the cost of cable. So I've even seen it here in the UK, where some of the altnets that we first started working with 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and their initial go-to-market, their heart was absolutely in the right place. They wanted to do, they knew bringing the capacity to the doorstep was just moving bottleneck. That's all it was doing. And now the bottleneck was inside the house. So they wanted to do a best-in-class install for their customers. So every install that they did included the in-home installation of the Wi-Fi equipment, the placement of the equipment, the testing of the equipment, and so on and so forth. And it performed exceptionally well. And they built a very good reputation off the back of that. The vast majority of those operators that went down that path now, as they're hitting scale, don't do that anymore because it's too expensive. It slows down the rollout. You know, they're half an hour extra in every household. You know, it really drives up their cost on that side of things. So without that kind of white glove, high touch type approach, it's very difficult to see a world where somebody would actually go in and run this passive optical LAN type cabling on behalf of a customer. You also run into things like connectorization and stuff like that. So we all know as an industry, ignore the telecoms industry, when you get into the consumer electronics industry, the ability to standardize on something there is nigh on impossible. You know, HDMI is probably the best we've got. So you can rest assured that, you know, if we did try and go down that path, you'd end up with 6 different connector types, and consumers would have to deal with, how do I plug this into that? And I need a media converter. You know, it's just the usual nonsense that we deal with in society. So I think it does offer a lot of potential, but I think the reality is it's too difficult to deploy, too expensive to deploy. Trying to arrange meetings for customers, going into, like, think of COVID times, going into people's homes and stuff like that. It's just, you know, society has shifted quite a bit on that. As a backdrop, wireless technology has improved quite a bit as well. And what we've seen on the wireless side of things, first of all, we've seen the introduction of more spectrum. So we've now got 6 gigahertz spectrum, which will, you know, as we start to offload devices off 5 gigahertz, that'll ingest 5 gigahertz and make that experience somewhat better. The other thing is there's a lot more focus in the industry around optimization of the spectrum that we already have. And what we're starting to see is smarter implementations of Wi-Fi. And the way I described it to one of our customers recently was, historically, the Wi-Fi upgrade cycles, if we think about the upgrade cycles of telecoms equipment, you know, the phone handset that went into your home had an upgrade cycle probably of every 20 years or so. When it came to things like ONTs, the optical network terminals that terminate your PON connection, they have an upgrade cycle of every 15 years. When you get down to things like a router within the home, maybe every 6 or 7 years. When you get down to the Wi-Fi equipment, it's every 3 years. Every 3 years, you've got to upgrade, going from Wi-Fi 4 to 5 to 6, as we call them now, or was BG, AC, AX, whatever. I've forgotten them all now at this point. But the point is, it was a very rapid upgrade cycle. And what I was describing to one of our customers now is, when you move into a world where you're bringing cloud automation, so AI, to monitoring the Wi-Fi equipment within the home, and constantly refining it and optimizing it, making sure the right channels are selected, making sure the devices are connected to the right gateways, and steering people appropriately. I anticipate that we'll double the lifespan of the equipment, because I think an awful lot of equipment got replaced prematurely, just simply because it wasn't being deployed optimally. And if you optimize the use of the spectrum that's available, and you optimize the devices that are connecting to each of the APs and gateways, etc., you can deliver a much higher performance for much, much longer. You know, so bringing a bit of smarts to it, I think, will help a lot more users get, I won't say the same experience, but an experience that, and at the end of the day, we're in the industry of good enough. It'll give them an experience that's good enough that it's not a pain point anymore. And then they don't think about it. And then they definitely, you know, when people talk about coming in to wire up their houses, if what they have is already good enough, they won't accept that, you know. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot of moving parts. There's been a lot of innovation to simplify the cable handling to the point where, you know, where you've got to polish the fibers. They're all sufficiently shielded now that people can't get fingerprints on them and stuff like that. But it still requires a degree of technical confidence for somebody to go playing with that stuff.
I'll go back to online. There's still quite a lot of questions
Sure,
here. This one's from Joni. I don't know quite how to pronounce this one. And he says, with a 1:32 split ratio, he calculates that a user could expect something around 300 megabits from XGS-PON.
If all users were trafficking at the same time.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
If that's right, it's good, but it's not astronomical.
Sure.
It's not gigabit connectivity, to quote yourself. He'd be more interested in latency performance that was significantly better than he currently has from fiber to the cabinet. Is there any reason to suppose that these PON technologies will give better latency?
Oh, without question. It's definitely better latency latency than going through a DSL system. The other thing I will say is, within the industry, we use a concept called statistical multiplexing. And that is, I've got a certain amount of capacity available for customers, whether it's in the backbone network, whether it's in the transport network, whether it's in the access network. And I share that capacity amongst those users, and I work on the presumption that all users don't try and use all the bandwidth at the exact same time. It's a very simple principle. When you're in a PON network and you're sharing amongst 32 people, the likelihood of all of that capacity being consumed amongst those 32 users at the exact same time is relatively low. So to make a statement, it's not gigabit technology. I understand the sentiment behind it, but I disagree with the fundamentals of it, because we know stat multiplexing has been around for decades within the industry, from Erlangs on oversubscribing voice switches and stuff like that, you know, so it's not a new concept. And what most of the operators that are deploying these technologies are watching very, very closely, because they're investing hundreds of millions in building out these infrastructures. The last thing they want is their consumer base calling them out going, you know, this thing's rubbish, it doesn't deliver what it said it's going to deliver, etc. So there is a lot of focus on that. Even in a point-to-point world, people have to remember, when I deliver point-to-point and I deliver a gig E connection over point-to-point, that switch that's delivering gig E needs an uplink. And it's very rare that I'll have a 24-port gigabit Ethernet switch delivering point-to-point services that has 24 gigs of uplink capacity servicing that switch. So even in a point-to-point world, you're actually in a point-to-multipoint type configuration from an uplink downlink perspective.
Another quicker question from Jan Zakakovsky. And he says, are you looking at any customer premises equipment which will enable upgrade to higher speed services without requiring a visit to change the ONT?
Give me one more time. Upgrade to higher uplink capacities.
He's wondering, he's asking if the ONTs are being engineered to support multiple generations of PON without physical visit. No,
because typically what happens there is, so if you picture I approach a national operator that's servicing, let's say, 20 million households, and I come along with that value proposition to say, I've got an ONT that is capable of XGS-PON and GPON. The expectation from that operator is, well, I've got 20 million households that I need to roll this out to. I will only pay the GPON price point today. So invariably what ends up happening is this becomes a financing question rather than a technical question, from the point of view of somebody has to bear the cost of the higher capacity components. And the operator themselves, if they only really need it for GPON today, you'll find they will never be willing to pay for the XGS-PON element of that until they need it. So that then leaves the vendor who has to bridge that gap. And vendors aren't banks either. So, you know, typically you end up with a financing gap between the two of those. Technically, it's all possible, but economically is where you run into the challenges.
So I could ask a supplementary question. Technically, is it possible to make that a customer replaceable item?
Yes, without question. And there are operators that do that.
Right, from CA Shaw, and he's asking for something technically about how GPON works. And he says he understands that GPON is time slicing the optical link to the subscriber CPE. what sort of figures are normal for the maximum number of packets sent back to back on a downlink to, say, subscriber A before the time slicing mechanism moves to subscriber B? I think you probably need to describe how downstream works and how upstream works, just to make it clear to CA Shaw.
So good observation. In the downstream direction, there is no time allocation applied. In the downstream direction, the OLT will pass all of the traffic down through the optical distribution network, down through the splitters, and every one of the ONTs will receive that traffic. The ONTs will look at whether it's addressed for them or not, and if it's not, they will ignore it, just like in an Ethernet broadcast domain type scenario. In the upstream direction, it is time allocated because you can only have one light source transmitting in the upstream direction at any given time, otherwise they interfere with each other and you get collisions and errors and so on and so forth. And what we do within the industry is a concept called dynamic timing allocation. So typically when somebody wants to transmit on the network, they will send a notification upstream saying, I want to transmit for X amount of capacity. And if that capacity is available, the OLT will give you that time slot that's necessary to transmit that. If it's not available, let's say the network's running congested, it will try and balance out the upstream capacity as much as possible, again, by allocating the time slots that are available. But the time slots are variable is the key thing there. So, it's not just one fixed time slot at any given time.
And a question which might relate to some of our previous talks. This one's from Morcom. Are there significantly increased vulnerabilities with 3 nanometer technology to sunspot storms?
I would love to know the answer to that. I do not.
Well, we can probably ask Gemma Attrell to give us a view on some of these chipsets, I guess. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. I can comment and say, to my knowledge, based on the mix of 24 and 16 nanometer that we have deployed globally to date, I'm not aware of any outages that have been triggered on those geometries due to sunspot storms or solar flares or any other cosmic interferences. But I'm not expert in that area to be able to comment as you go down on the geometry sizes as to whether you become more susceptible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronan. Much appreciated. And thank you, George, for managing the questions, and Felix for hosting us at the University of Suffolk here, and the IET team who put on the event. So a big thank you to you all. And thanks also to the audience here at the atrium, and also to the audience online. Again, I'd like to say a big thanks to Ronan, a big thanks to the audience. Very interesting talk, great evening, good questions and audience participation. So thank you very much.